The trail stretched for miles, empty, silent, unforgiving, and in the middle of it stood a little girl no older than 8, her small hands wrapped tightly around a worn bundle, as if letting go would mean losing the last piece of herself she had left. And she did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood there as the heat pressed down on her shoulders and the dust clung to her shoes. Because the last words she heard still echoed clearly in her mind. "Stay right here. I will be back." Words. Spoken by the one person she was supposed to trust. Words she obeyed without question, and for a long time she believed them. Even as the wagon rolled farther away, even as its sound faded into nothing, even as the horizon swallowed it whole, she believed, until belief slowly turned into something heavier, something colder, the kind of realization that no child should ever have to face alone, that she was not waiting anymore. She had been left behind, and time passed in a way that felt endless. The sun climbed higher, shadows shrank beneath her feet, and still she did not move, counting quietly to herself just to hold on to something, anything, until the silence around her began to feel louder than sound, until even the wind seemed to disappear, and then, somewhere in the distance, it broke, a faint rhythm at first, almost imagined, but steady, growing closer, the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats crossing the dry earth. And for the first time since she was left alone, Maggie lifted her head, because someone was coming, someone who would change everything that followed. But out here, where no one was watching and nothing came without a price, not everyone who finds you is there to save you. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Maggie did not move even as the sound grew closer, her fingers tightening around the small bundle she carried, her eyes fixed on the distant figure taking shape through the heat. And in that moment, the question was no longer just why she had been left behind, but what would happen next, because children are taught to trust, to believe that adults mean what they say, that promises will be kept. Yet standing there alone on that endless trail, Maggie was already learning something far more difficult, that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who walk away. And the reasons behind it are not always simple, not always clear, which raises a question that lingers long after the moment has passed. Who leaves a child alone in a place like this and calls it anything but intentional? Was it fear that drove Eliza to make that choice? Was it desperation, or was it something she had already decided long before that wagon ever stopped? Because nothing about that morning suggested panic. Nothing about it felt rushed, and yet Maggie was still there, waiting in the silence she had been told to trust. And as the wagon disappeared beyond the horizon, taking with it every answer she deserved, another presence entered the story, slow, steady, unavoidable. The man on horseback who had now seen her, who was now riding closer with every passing second, and with him came a new uncertainty, because out here, far from towns and rules and watchful eyes, kindness was never guaranteed, and help could look a lot like danger until it proved otherwise. So as Maggie stood there clutching what little she had left, watching this stranger approach without a word, the questions only deepened. Was this man about to save her life, or step into it for reasons she could not yet understand? What really happened on that trail that day? And why did it begin with someone she trusted and continue with someone she had never met? Maggie Bell Hart was not always the quiet figure standing alone on a trail with no one to turn to, because there was a time when her world felt whole, when the days were filled with small, simple routines that made life feel steady. And at the center of that world was her father, a man who spoke gently, who listened when she talked, who made sure she never felt unseen, and for a while, that was enough to make everything else feel safe. Even after her mother passed and left behind a silence that settled into the corners of their home, a silence her father tried to fill the best way he knew how, until one day he made a decision that would change everything. He brought someone new into their lives, a woman named Eliza, who arrived with a soft voice and careful smiles, who knew exactly how to present herself in a way that made doubt seem unnecessary. And at first, Maggie wanted to believe in her, because children often do. They reach for warmth wherever they can find it, especially after loss. And Eliza gave just enough of it to make her presence feel acceptable, even comforting. But over time, something shifted in ways that were difficult to explain yet impossible to ignore. The warmth did not disappear all at once. It faded slowly, replaced by distance, by moments where Maggie's words were met with silence, by looks that lingered just a little too long without kindness behind them. And though nothing was ever said directly, the message became clear in the way Eliza moved through the house, in the way she chose when to speak and when to turn away, creating a quiet tension that Maggie could feel but not fully understand. And as the days passed, that tension only grew stronger, especially when her father began to fall ill, because illness has a way of changing more than just the person it touches. It shifts responsibilities, exposes truths, and brings hidden intentions closer to the surface. And for Maggie, it marked the beginning of something unraveling, something that would eventually lead her from a home that once felt safe to a place where safety no longer existed, standing alone on a trail, holding onto the memory of a life that now felt impossibly far away. The morning they left carried no sense of urgency, no raised voices, no clear sign that anything was about to change. And that is what made it so difficult to question, because everything about it appeared ordinary, the kind of quiet departure that happens without much thought. With Eliza guiding the wagon forward as Maggie sat beside her, watching the land stretch endlessly ahead, the wheels turning in a slow, steady rhythm that felt almost calming. And yet there was something beneath that calm that Maggie could not quite name, a feeling that settled in her chest without explanation, because silence can mean many things, and on that morning, it meant more than she understood at the time. The road they followed grew emptier with every mile, the familiar fading into something distant, until there was nothing left but open land and the sound of movement cutting through it. And still no words were spoken, not from Eliza, not from anyone, just that same quiet presence that had been growing for weeks now, heavier than before, more final in a way that Maggie would only recognize later. And then, without warning, the wagon slowed, the wheels grinding gently against the dry earth before coming to a complete stop. And for a brief moment, nothing happened, no explanation, no urgency, just stillness, until Eliza turned, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled reassurance, though it did not reach her eyes, and she told Maggie to step down, her voice steady, controlled, as if this was just another simple request that required no question, no hesitation. And Maggie listened, because she had always listened, because children are taught to follow instructions, to trust that the adults guiding them know what they are doing. So she climbed down from the wagon and stood there, looking up, waiting for what would come next. But there was nothing more, just two words that would stay with her long after the moment passed. Wait here, and then a pause that stretched longer than it should have, long enough to feel unfamiliar, long enough to leave space for doubt to begin forming, but not long enough for Maggie to act on it. Because before she could fully understand what was happening, the wagon moved again, slowly at first, then steadily forward, and Maggie remained where she was, watching as distance grew between them, expecting it to stop, expecting Eliza to turn back, expecting something to confirm that this was temporary, that she had not just been left behind. But none of that happened. The wagon did not slow. It did not turn. It continued forward until it became smaller, until it blurred into the horizon, until it disappeared completely. And even then Maggie stayed where she was, holding on to the instruction she had been given, believing in it because that was all she had, not realizing that what she had just witnessed was not a moment of separation, but a decision, one that had already been made long before that wagon ever came to a stop. And as the silence returned, heavier than before, it marked the beginning of something she could not yet see clearly, that she was no longer part of the journey, and the wagon that carried her there was never coming back. Hours passed in a way that felt stretched beyond time itself, each minute blending into the next as the sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down harder, and Maggie remained exactly where she had been told to stand, her small frame steady despite the exhaustion beginning to show in the way she shifted her weight, because leaving that spot would mean letting go of the last instruction she had been given, the last connection to someone who was supposed to return. And even as doubt settled deeper into her thoughts, she held on, because hope, even when it begins to fade, does not disappear all at once. It lingers, it convinces, it keeps a child rooted in place long after logic would suggest otherwise. And then, just as the silence had begun to feel complete, It broke, not loudly, not suddenly, but with a distant rhythm that carried across the open land, a sound that did not belong to the stillness she had grown used to. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, each one closing the distance between where she stood and whatever was approaching, and Maggie lifted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly against the light as she tried to make sense of the figure forming in the distance. A man on horseback, moving with a calm that suggested he was in no hurry, his outline becoming clearer with every step forward, until the details began to take shape. A weathered face marked by years of experience, eyes that observed more than they revealed, and a presence that felt steady, controlled, the kind that did not need to announce itself to be understood. And still he did not rush. He did not call out from afar. He simply approached until the space between them was small enough for words to matter. And even then, he paused, studying the scene before him, a young girl standing alone where no one should be. And in places like this, people learn quickly that not every situation is as simple as it appears. That trust is something earned slowly, carefully, because mistakes carry consequences that cannot always be undone. So when he finally spoke, his voice was measured, direct, asking a question that carried more weight than its words suggested. "What are you doing out here alone?" And Maggie, who had every reason to feel fear, every reason to break under the weight of what had happened, did neither. She did not cry. She did not step back. She did not search for an explanation she could not yet fully form. She simply answered with the truth as she understood it, her voice quiet but certain. "I'm waiting," because in her mind, that was still what this was, a moment that had not yet reached its conclusion, even as everything around her pointed to something else entirely. The man listened carefully, not interrupting, not rushing her, allowing the weight of her words to settle between them. And as Maggie stood there holding onto the belief that she was still waiting, something in his expression shifted in a way that was quiet but unmistakable. Because this was not a story he was hearing for the first time, it was one he recognized in the details she did not even realize she was giving: the stillness, the obedience, the absence of urgency from the one who left. And the longer he looked at her, the clearer it became that this was not confusion, not a misunderstanding, not a moment that had gotten out of hand. This was a choice, one that had been made with enough certainty to leave a child alone in a place where survival was never guaranteed. And that realization settled heavily, not just in the silence between them, but in the way his posture changed, in the way his eyes moved briefly toward the empty trail behind her, as if confirming what he already knew, that no one was coming back, that the promise she was holding on to had already been broken long before he arrived. And while Maggie remained steady, still anchored to the instruction she had been given, he understood something she could not yet fully accept, that waiting here would not lead to rescue. It would only lead to something far worse, because he had seen what happens when situations like this are ignored, when assumptions are made that someone else will return, when time is allowed to pass without action. And in that moment, standing between what had already happened and what could still be prevented, he made a decision, not one driven by impulse, but by experience, by the quiet certainty that leaving her there was not an option, a decision that would alter the course of Maggie's life in ways she could not yet imagine. Because sometimes the difference between loss and survival comes down to a single choice made by someone who understands what is truly at stake. He did not turn his horse away. He did not offer empty reassurance or leave her with the same fragile hope she had been holding on to for hours. Instead, he reached down with a steady hand and offered something simple but immediate: water, the kind that grounds a moment and replaces waiting with action. And Maggie accepted it without hesitation, her small hands trembling slightly as she held on to something real for the first time since the wagon disappeared. And without making it feel sudden or overwhelming, he lifted her carefully onto his horse, giving her a place that felt secure, a place that moved her away from the spot where everything had changed. And as they began to leave that trail behind, the distance between Maggie and what had been done to her finally started to grow, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer the only thing defining her moment. And for the first time since she had been told to wait, she was no longer standing still, no longer tied to a promise that had already been broken. She was moving forward, guided by someone who had chosen to act when it mattered. And that choice, quiet and without recognition, became the reason she survived. Not because the world had suddenly become fair or gentle, but because one person, a stranger with no obligation to her, decided that leaving her there was not acceptable, and that decision carried her toward safety, toward a future that could have easily been taken from her. And even as the distance grew and the trail faded behind them, one question remained, lingering in a way that could not be ignored. What kind of person looks at a child, speaks words meant to be trusted, and then walks away without ever looking back? Because the answer to that question says more about the choices people make than any explanation ever could. Do you think Eliza planned what happened on that trail? Or do you believe there was something more behind the choice she made that day? Something Maggie may never fully understand, because the difference between intention and explanation can change how a story is remembered. And if you place yourself in Maggie's position, standing alone with no clear answers and a stranger riding toward you, would you have trusted the cowboy? Would you have taken his hand without knowing what came next? Or would fear have held you in place, unable to move forward? Let us know what you think in the comments, because stories like this are not just about what happened. They are about how we interpret the choices within them. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think, reflect, or even question how quickly trust can be given or taken away, then subscribe for more real stories that stay with you long after they end.